Welcome to Global Tax Talk. I'm Chloe Fox. I recently had the opportunity to sit down with Edwin, Visser and Keetie, Jakma in Prague, where we recorded a series of videos looking at the 2025 EU tax agenda. In this video, we address the interactions between Pillar 2 and tax incentives, which to many represent an elephant in the room. We'll also look at the future of Pillar 2 in Europe.
There's lots of discussion on Pillar 2. President Trump has signed some executive orders and asked the Secretary for the Treasury and the Foreign Trade Representative to, map options to combat, those what they call discriminatory and extraterritorial taxes, a difficult word. So what is the state of play in the European Union? You have the directive, of course, the Global Minimum Tax Directive. You have administrative guidance, not implemented at the EU level, but at the member state level. So what can the EU do? What do you think could happen? What are the scenarios?
Thanks, Edwin.
Lots of questions, difficult questions, but
Good luck. Absolutely. But I mean, the questions that businesses and our clients are having to deal with, on an ongoing basis. I suppose maybe just to take it back to basics, where are we at in terms of Pillar 2 in the EU at the moment? So because of the Global Minimum Tax Directive, we already have broad implementation of the Pillar 2 rules, both across the 27 EU member states, but then also we have similar rules across the non-EU European countries. I suppose when we think about the UTPR, which is really the issue that the US have in terms of the way that it applies, they think that it's extraterritorial in nature and that it discriminates predominantly against US multinationals. The UTPR, it is an important part of Pillar 2 because ultimately it is the backstop to make sure that the revenues are collected. But it does cause its own set of problems. So it does bring legal uncertainty in terms of how it interacts with existing double tax treaties, how it interacts with EU fundamental freedoms. So it does bring its own issues. I suppose from an EU perspective, we're kind of uniquely positioned in that we have had adoption of the UTPR because of the Global Minimum Tax Directive within the 27 EU member states from 1 January 2025. Now that is probably, compared to the rest of the world, that's very unusual. So many countries have not adopted the UTPR for exactly those same reasons, because the US has indicated that it is not in favour, and it has said that it might, I suppose it's putting pressure on countries to not introduce the UTPR, or if they have already introduced it, maybe to try and push it out for an extra year. So it's a really tricky position, I think, that the companies are in terms of what is going to happen in terms of the UTPR. Should they be factoring it in terms of future modelling and in terms of future collection payments? I suppose other than that, in terms of, what is the EU doing, or what should it be doing more broadly in terms of Pillar 2? Some member states, and indeed, a number of kind of lobby groups or industry groups within the EU, they have been trying to raise noise around simplifying Pillar 2. Now, it's obvious why that's needed, because Pillar 2 is such a significant compliance lift for the businesses that are in scope.
Yeah, it's horrendously complex.
Horrendously, absolutely horrendously complex. I suppose, where does the EU sit in terms of its ability to influence what broader simplification could happen? I do think that the EU is positioned in such a way that it could have an influence at OECD level, at G20 level, at G7 level. If it really wanted to, I think it could start those conversations around what could a more simplified Pillar 2 look like. I mean, the obvious example is an extension of the temporary safe harbours.
Well, that's interesting. I have a question on that, because that's what some people say, extend the safe harbour for the UTPR. But when I speak to people in Brussels, notably from countries that would say, suspend or push the pause button for Pillar 2, they think if you extend the UTPR, the momentum for fundamental change of the rules of Pillar 2 is sort of gone for the next years. And that's a fundamental point, I think, because many believe, and I do too, that Pillar 2 in its current form puts the EU in a competitive disadvantage compared to US companies, for example. That's also the point of view of the organized industry in Germany. So how would you see, extension of the UTPR? Yes, fine, to buy some time to negotiate, I would say. But what else could the EU do, or the OECD do, to, modify the rules, take away the competitive disadvantage, and make life easier for companies without defying the underlying goals of Pillar 2? Because I think that's still important, they're still relevant.
Yeah, so I think if you're to step back and look at the narrative that's coming out of the US at the moment, My own personal opinion is that an extension of the UTPR safe harbour for 1, 2, 3, 5 years will not be sufficient to get the US to come back to the table and to have a broad conversation about how Pillar 2 will operate. At the moment, we have the UTPR safe harbour applies for this particular year, but it is due to run out at the end of the year. I don't personally see a situation whereby an extension of the UTPR temporary safe harbour really achieves what the US is trying to achieve here. It is trying to achieve, broad pause, modification, or ideally disintegration of the UTPR rule. I suppose what could we do that would actually achieve some kind of simplification? The thing that the business community certainly wants is an extension of the other current temporary safe harbours. So for example, the CBCR safe harbour, that would be, an obvious way that we could achieve genuine simplification, because it would really take away, I suppose, the very heavy compliance lift for companies that are located in jurisdictions that are essentially non-risk from a Pillar 2 perspective, because either the statutory rate is very high or they don't avail of incentives, etc.
No, I see room for improvement indeed. And you mentioned compliance costs. That brings me to figures and financials. In January, a report of the European Commission of the Joint Research Centre was published. It shows that Pillar 2 will increase total revenue, tax revenue in the EU with 0.3%. So what's your take on that? Is that significant, or is that a disappointment for policymakers, do you think?
It's a great question. So you're right. So the current projections are that it will increase tax revenues by 0.3% of the total tax take. But if you're to look at it in the bigger picture, Pillar 2 will actually result in a drop in GDP of 0.2%. So that's most of the ground already eroded from underneath the additional revenues that would be raised. But if you're to factor on top of that the labour costs, the resource costs for businesses of dealing with Pillar 2, and then also factor in the opportunity cost. I mean, the tax function could be doing other work. If you're to factor in all those costs, I think from a financial perspective, Pillar 2 will ultimately, it will result in a situation whereby we lose money rather than gain money from Pillar 2.
Yeah, and now the narrative around Pillar 2 seems to change, because I heard Benjamin Angel, the Director for Direct Taxation of the European Commission, say, well, maybe it's less about revenue and more about changing behavior of companies and countries. What do you think about this change of narrative? Or has this narrative always been underlying the Pillar 2 discussion, changing behavior?
I think there has always been an element of Pillar 2 was to achieve two things. So if we think about it, when did Pillar 2, when was it originally designed? So it was designed post-2020 in the wake of, a huge need for finances to serve COVID supports. So originally it was designed as a revenue raising measure, but it did always have an element of setting a minimum floor for corporate taxpayers. So it did have that behavioural element as well. I think now it's...
And that already happens, because low tax countries introduce taxes of 15% or corporate income taxes at all, like the Emirates, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that is the one tangible, I think, positive that we can see from a Pillar 2 perspective, in terms of some countries that maybe had low or no corporate income tax regimes. They have now introduced such rules. But I think in terms of the financial gain that we originally expected, I don't think we will ultimately realise that. In terms of taxpayer behaviour, in terms of, real or perceived avoidance strategies, I think the jury is probably still out in terms of whether or not it will have an impact.
So do you agree if I say and summarize your words, the Pillar 2 directive needs drastic simplification, Pillar 2 model rules need drastic simplification, it needs a rethink in order to restore the competitive level of countries in the EU compared to the US, and certainly the UTPR should be reconsidered. Although I think, the sentiment in the US right now is that the UTPR should disappear from the rules. That will make an important backstop go away from the system. So I'm not sure that the OECD will buy into that, but let's see. So important changes are needed to make Pillar 2 really work.
I agree. I do think we ultimately need to go back to the drawing board to figure out what is it that we want Pillar 2 to achieve, and what is the least costly way to achieve that, so that it does generate revenues, but it doesn't hugely impact the businesses and the tax administrations that are forced to comply with it. I think that's the only way we can really move forward with it at this point.
Thanks, Chloe.
Based on recent comments from US Treasury officials, we know that the US is engaged and actively talking to other inclusive framework countries. The US position on Pillar 2 seems to be that the tax sovereignty of all countries should be respected and that the US GILTI regime and Pillar 2 should coexist to create a more stable tax environment. While any timeframe for reaching such solutions still remains unclear, we do know that the UTPR safe harbour runs out at the end of the year, so expect negotiations to move along quickly. Anyway, there's a lot more to come on this. Thank you for joining us. Come back next time so that you stay global tax ready.